The man in the gray coat leaned toward me at my father's graveside and said, "Your name isn't Ethan. It never was." I thought I misheard him. I thought grief was playing tricks on my ears. But then he said it again, slower this time, like he wanted every word to land. "Your real name is Caleb Weiss, and I knew your father before you were born." I stood there in a black suit that still smelled like the dry cleaner's plastic, holding a single white rose I hadn't dropped into the grave yet, and I felt the ground tilt under my feet. My mother was 20 feet away, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, unaware that a stranger had just detonated a bomb inside my chest. I didn't know this man. I had never seen his face before in my life. But somehow, he knew something about me that I had never known about myself. If you're new here, welcome to the Quiet Rise, the place where we tell true, raw, human stories about the moments that change everything. If stories like this one speak to you, stick around and subscribe, because every week, we bring you another journey worth taking. Now, back to that graveside, because what happened next changed the rest of my life. I turned to ask the man who he was, but by the time I looked back, he had already stepped away from the small crowd of mourners, disappearing behind the maple trees that lined the cemetery road. I almost went after him right there, funeral or not, but my mother called my name, my real name, the one I'd carried for 34 years, and I froze. Ethan. Not Caleb. Ethan Hale. That was who I was. That was who I had always been. I told myself the man was confused, maybe drunk, maybe grieving someone else entirely and wandering through the wrong service. Funerals draw strange energy sometimes. People show up uninvited. People show up who shouldn't. People whisper things they have no right to whisper. I finished the burial. I shook hands with men I barely recognized from my father's old machine shop. I hugged my Aunt Ruth, who cried harder than anyone, and I drove my mother home in silence because neither of us had anything left to say. But that night, lying in my childhood bedroom because I couldn't bring myself to go back to my own apartment yet, I couldn't stop hearing his voice. Caleb Weiss. It didn't sound like nonsense. It sounded like a name that belonged somewhere, like a key that fit a lock I didn't know existed. I got up at 2 in the morning and searched it on my phone. Nothing came up that made sense. No obituary, no old news article, no social media trail, just silence. The same silence my father had taken with him into that grave. The next morning I found my mother in the kitchen, staring at a mug of coffee she wasn't drinking. She looked smaller than she had the day before, like grief had physically shrunk her overnight. I almost didn't ask. I almost let it go, because she looked like she couldn't survive one more hard question. But something in me needed the truth, more than I needed to protect her feelings. "Mom," I said, sitting across from her, "did Dad ever know someone named Weiss?" Her hand froze around the mug. Just for a second, if I hadn't been watching closely, I might have missed it. But I saw it, the way her knuckles went white, the way her breath caught somewhere between her throat and her chest. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked, and her voice wasn't confused. It was afraid. I told her about the man at the funeral, about the gray coat, about the words that still echoed in my skull. She set the mug down so carefully it barely made a sound, and for a long moment she just stared at the table like she was reading something written there that only she could see. "Your father always said this day might come," she finally whispered. "I just didn't think it would come so soon." I asked her what she meant. She wouldn't answer. Not fully. Not yet. She told me to give her time, that some things weren't meant to be explained, standing in a kitchen the day after a burial. I wanted to push harder, but I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for far too long, and I backed off. Now, 2 days passed. I went back to my apartment, back to my job managing operations at a mid-sized logistics company, back to a life that suddenly felt like a costume I'd been wearing without knowing it. Every time a coworker said Ethan, it landed strange in my ears, like a name I was borrowing rather than owning. I couldn't focus. I couldn't sleep. And then, on the 3rd day, an envelope arrived at my apartment with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. A young couple, maybe in their late 20s, standing in front of a modest house I didn't recognize. The woman looked nothing like my mother. The man had my jaw, my eyes, even my slightly crooked smile. On the back, in careful handwriting, someone had written 3 words. "Ask her again." I drove to my mother's house, that same evening, photograph in hand, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. She opened the door, already crying, like she somehow knew this was coming before I even said a word. I held up the photos. She looked at it for a long moment, then covered her mouth with both hands and sat down hard on the porch step, right there in the cold. "That's Daniel," she said finally. "Daniel Weiss. He was your father's business partner back before you were born, back before we ever moved here." She wiped her face with the back of her hand. "And the woman next to him, that's his wife, Miriam." I asked her the question that had been building in my chest since the cemetery. "Mom, am I their son?" She looked up at me, And for the first time in my entire life, I watched my mother struggle to find words. "No," she said slowly, "but you're connected to them in a way I never wanted you to have to understand." She took a breath, like she was about to jump into cold water. "Your father and Daniel Weiss started a machine parts business together, back in the early 90s. It did well, better than either of them expected. And then something happened that tore everything apart." She told me that Daniel Weiss had a son, born just 11 days before I was born, in the same hospital, delivered by the same doctor. 2 families, 2 boys, 2 futures that were supposed to run in parallel. But 3 months later, Daniel Weiss vanished. Along with him went nearly everything in the company's accounts. Money that belonged to both families. Money my father had spent years rebuilding after the betrayal nearly bankrupted us. "So why did a stranger call me Caleb at the funeral?" I asked, my voice shaking now. "Why does that name mean anything to me?" My mother closed her eyes. "Because for a while, your father considered naming you Caleb, after his own father. But everything changed the week you were born. Daniel disappeared. The money disappeared. And your father was terrified that whoever Daniel had crossed to get that money moving that fast might come looking for anyone connected to him. So he changed your name at the last possible moment, before the birth certificate was even filed. He wanted you to have no trace of a connection to any of it. Ethan wasn't just a name he liked. It was a wall he built around you before you could even open your eyes." I sat there on the cold porch step, trying to absorb a truth that rewrote 34 years of my life in less than 5 minutes. My father, a man I thought I knew completely, a man who fixed my bike tires and taught me how to shake hands firmly and never once raised his voice at the dinner table, had been hiding something enormous the entire time. Not a small secret. Not a white lie. A decision that shaped my entire identity before I ever spoke my first word. "Who was the man at the funeral?" I asked. "The one who called me Caleb." My mother shook her head slowly. "I don't know his face, but if he knew that name, he knew your father from back then. And that terrifies me, Ethan, because the only people who knew about that almost name were people connected to Daniel Weiss." That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about the boy born 11 days before me, the son of the man who vanished with the money. Somewhere out there was a person my exact age who had grown up without a father, while I had grown up with one who quietly rebuilt his life in the shadow of a betrayal he never spoke about. 2 boys, 1 story, split down the middle by a decision made before either of us understood what was happening. The following week, I decided I needed answers that my mother couldn't give me. I went to the courthouse in the county where I was born and requested my original birth certificate. The clerk handed me a certified copy, and there it was, in official ink, Ethan Michael Hale. No trace of Caleb, no trace of Weiss. Whatever my father had done, he had done it cleanly, legally, permanently. But paperwork can hide a name. It can't erase a history. I started searching for Daniel Weiss's son. It felt strange, almost invasive, hunting for a stranger who shared an eerie parallel with my own life. But something pulled me forward. Some need to understand the other half of the story my father never told. After days of digging through old business records, court filings, and a fraud case I found buried in county archives, I found a name. Nathan Weiss, same age as me, living 2 states away. I sat with that name for 3 full days before I worked up the courage to reach out. Part of me was afraid he'd slam the door the moment he heard mine. After all, if his father had stolen from mine, what would he think when the son of the victim showed up asking questions? But another part of me, a part I didn't fully understand yet, felt like finding him wasn't optional anymore. It felt like something my father had left unfinished. I sent a message through an old business networking site. Something short and careful. I told him my father had recently passed, that our fathers had once been partners, and that I had some questions I hoped he'd be willing to answer. I didn't mention the name Caleb. I didn't mention the stranger at the funeral. I wanted to see what he knew before I revealed what I knew. 3 days passed with no response. I assumed he'd ignored it, or worse, that the message had scared him off entirely. Then, on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. Something told me to answer it anyway. "Is this Ethan?" the voice asked. It was steady, cautious, but not unkind. "Yes," I said. "Is this Nathan?" There was a long pause on the other end, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he spoke again. Quieter this time. "I've been waiting 34 years for someone from your family to reach out. I just didn't expect it to be you." We talked for almost 2 hours that night. Nathan told me things that reshaped everything my mother had explained, and things that contradicted parts of it entirely. He said his father, Daniel, hadn't vanished with the company's money out of greed. He said Daniel had discovered something inside the business that terrified him. Something involving a third investor neither of our fathers had ever mentioned publicly. A man with connections that made ordinary bankruptcy look like the safer option. Daniel hadn't run to steal. Daniel had run to survive. My mother and I moved 4 times before I turned 10. Nathan told me. Different names, different towns, always one step ahead of something my dad never fully explained to us either. He died when I was 16. Car accident, they said. My mother never fully believed that. She thought someone finally caught up with him. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as he spoke. If Nathan was telling the truth, then the story my mother knew, the story my father had built our entire family history around, might only be half of what actually happened. And if there really had been a third investor, someone dangerous enough to make two grown men uproot their families and vanish, then the man in the gray coat at my father's funeral suddenly felt less like a strange coincidence and more like a warning. I asked Nathan if he had ever heard of a man matching that description, someone connected to his father's old business dealings. He went quiet again, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped almost to a whisper. There was a man who used to call my mother sometimes, years after we moved. He never gave a name. He always asked the same question. He wanted to know if we'd heard from anyone connected to the Hale family. My mother always hung up on him. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see clearly, but couldn't stop staring at anyway. Someone out there had been tracking both families for over 3 decades. Waiting, watching, patient in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like a debt collector who never forgets. And if that man had shown up at my father's funeral calling me by a name only a handful of people should have known, it meant he had been close enough to my family, or my father's old records, to know details that should have died with the men who buried them. I told Nathan everything, the photograph, the note that said, "Ask her again." The way my mother's hands shook when she finally told me the truth. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said something that changed the direction of everything that followed. I think our fathers didn't just walk away from a partnership. I think they were forced to make a choice. And I think one of them made a promise to protect the other's family if anything ever happened. That's why he changed your name. He wasn't just protecting you from embarrassment. He was protecting you from someone. We agreed to meet in person the following weekend, both of us equally desperate to understand a history that had been quietly steering our lives without either of us realizing it. I told my mother I was going out of town for work. I didn't want her carrying more worry than she already had. Not until I understood exactly what I was walking into. The drive to meet Nathan felt longer than the actual miles. I kept rehearsing what I would say, how I would explain that I wasn't there to blame him for what his father did, that I only wanted to understand what had shattered the families, before either of us could form our first memories. When I finally saw him waiting outside a small diner, tall, dark-haired, with the same nervous energy I recognized in my own reflection some mornings, something in my chest loosened just slightly. He looked like someone who had been carrying the same invisible weight I had only discovered a week ago. We sat in a corner booth for almost 3 hours, comparing scattered fragments of a puzzle neither of us had the full picture of. Nathan showed me an old photograph his mother had kept, one of our fathers standing together at what looked like a company anniversary party, both of them laughing, both of them looking like nothing in the world could ever come between them. It was strange, seeing my father young and unburdened, before whatever happened, had carved permanent caution into every decision he made for the rest of his life. "There's something else," Nathan said, sliding a folded piece of paper across the table. "My mother gave me this before she passed last year. She said if anyone from the Hale family ever came looking, I should give it to them." I unfolded it slowly. It was a short letter, handwritten, dated almost 3 decades earlier. I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my father's. The letter was addressed to Daniel. In it, my father apologized for something he called the choice we had to make, and promised that if Daniel's family was ever endangered because of what happened, he would do whatever it took to protect them, even if it meant staying silent for the rest of his life. He wrote that some debts aren't about money. They're about keeping people alive, and that he would rather carry the blame forever than let the truth put either family back in danger. I sat there holding proof that my father hadn't just been hiding a business betrayal. He had been protecting a man he loved like a brother, sacrificing his own reputation, maybe even his own peace, to keep a dangerous secret buried. Suddenly, the man in the gray coat wasn't just a stranger with unsettling information. He might be someone connected to the very danger my father spent his entire life trying to keep contained. That night, back at my apartment, I tried calling my mother to ask if she knew anything about this letter. She didn't answer. I called again 10 minutes later, and again 20 minutes after that. By the third unanswered call, panic started crawling up my spine. I drove straight to her house, breaking every speed limit along the way, imagining every terrible possibility a grieving, frightened mind could invent. Her porch light was off when I arrived, which wasn't like her. I knocked, then pounded, then finally used my spare key with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The house was dark, but not empty. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, untouched tea, gone cold in front of her, staring at her phone like it had betrayed her, somehow. "Someone called," she said before I could even ask. "A man, he knew things, Ethan. He knew things nobody should know, unless they were there 30 years ago." Her voice cracked. "He said if I wanted to keep you safe, I needed to convince you to stop asking questions." I felt my stomach drop through the floor. Whoever this man was, He wasn't a distant memory anymore. He was active, present, and apparently willing to reach directly into our lives to stop us from uncovering whatever truth still remained buried. I asked my mother if she recognized his voice. She shook her head, but there was something in her eyes, some flicker of recognition she couldn't quite name out loud. "There's something I never told you," she finally admitted. "The night your father died, he wasn't alone in the hospital room before I arrived. A nurse mentioned a man had visited him briefly. Someone who wasn't on the approved visitor list. Your father never mentioned who it was. Ehust told me right before he passed to be careful if anyone ever came asking about Caleb." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My father had known this moment might come. He had spent his last conscious hours preparing a warning, not for himself, but for the family he would leave behind. Whatever secret he had carried for 3 decades wasn't finished. It was waking back up, and it seemed determined to follow us straight into the present. I called Nathan the next morning and told him everything. We agreed that whoever this man was, he clearly believed one or both of us knew something valuable, something worth threatening a grieving widow to suppress. Nathan suggested we go back further, past the business partnership, past the missing money, straight to the source of whatever had frightened 2 young fathers enough to blow up their entire lives to protect their families. We spent the following 2 weeks digging through old court records, business filings, and newspaper archives from the small town where our father's company had operated. Eventually, we found what we were looking for, buried in a decades-old fraud investigation that had quietly gone cold. A third name appeared repeatedly throughout the documents: Victor Renner, a silent investor who had funneled money into the company under a series of shell corporations, money that later turned out to be connected to a much larger financial crime that had never been fully prosecuted, according to the file. Investigators at the time suspected Renner of laundering funds through several small manufacturing businesses, using unsuspecting or willingly blind partners as cover. When the investigation started closing in, records suggested that 2 of Renner's business fronts had abruptly folded, their owners vanishing without a trace, their families relocating under circumstances that were never fully explained. Our father's company was one of them. It finally made sense. Daniel hadn't stolen the company's money to enrich himself. He had likely uncovered Renner's operation, panicked, and disappeared to keep his family out of the crossfire, taking enough money with him to survive, but leaving my father to face the fallout of an investigation neither of them could safely explain. My father had stayed behind, rebuilt what he could, and quietly protected the secret for the rest of his life, terrified that speaking a single word might bring Renner's attention back to either family. If Renner, or someone connected to him, was still alive and still watching, it meant the gray-coated stranger at my father's funeral might not have been a messenger from the past at all. He might have been an active threat, testing whether the Hale family still remembered anything dangerous, whether we were worth silencing before old secrets resurfaced in a world with far better technology for digging up buried truths than existed 30 years ago. Nathan and I decided we couldn't sit on this information any longer. Not after the phone call to my mother. We contacted the retired detective Nathan's mother had once trusted, a man named Arthur Jen, who had worked the original fraud case decades earlier, before it went cold due to lack of evidence and vanished witnesses. He agreed to meet us, cautious but intrigued that 2 sons of the original victims had reappeared with new information after all these years. Arthur listened to our entire story without interrupting once, his expression darkening as the pieces connected in front of him. When we finished, he leaned back and said quietly, "Victor Renner never went to prison. The case fell apart because every witness either disappeared or refused to testify. If someone is still protecting his interests after all this time, it means whatever he built with that laundered money never got fully and that means people are still profiting from it today." He told us that reopening an investigation this old wouldn't be easy, especially without solid evidence, but the threatening phone call to my mother changed things. Witness intimidation was a real, prosecutable crime, and if we could trace that call or identify the man from the funeral, we might finally have enough to force real answers after 3 decades of silence. Over the following weeks, working alongside Arthur, we managed to trace the phone call to a prepaid number purchased at a convenience store 2 towns over. Paid for in cash, no security footage available after that much time had passed. It was a dead end on its own. But Arthur suggested something else. He remembered an associate of Renner's from the original case, a man named Gerald Post, who had once served as a kind of enforcer for Renner's operations. Someone known for delivering threats disguised as friendly warnings. We found an address for Gerald Post, now in his 60s, living quietly outside the city in a modest ranch house that looked nothing like the residence of a man once connected to organized financial crime. Arthur advised against confronting him directly, worried it might spook him into silence or worse. Instead, we requested a formal interview through his attorney, framing it as a routine follow-up related to an old, unresolved case being re-examined. To our surprise, Gerald agreed to talk, perhaps sensing that after 30 years, the statute of limitations and his own advancing age made him less afraid of consequences than he once was. When we sat across from him in a small conference room with Arthur present, Gerald studied both of our faces for a long moment before speaking. "You look just like your fathers," he said finally, looking between Nathan and me. "Both of you." He rubbed his hands together like he was working up the nerve for something. "I was young and stupid when I worked for Renner. I delivered messages I shouldn't have delivered. I scared people I had no business scaring. Your fathers didn't do anything wrong, except get too close to something they weren't supposed to see." He confirmed everything Arthur suspected. Renner had indeed been running a laundering operation through several small manufacturing partnerships, and when Daniel Weiss discovered irregularities in the company's books that didn't match legitimate business activity, Renner grew concerned enough to send Gerald to deliver a warning. Daniel fled that same week, taking cash to protect his family, while my father, unaware of the full danger until it was too late, was left to deal with Renner's growing suspicion that he knew too much as well. "Your dad made a deal," Gerald said, looking directly at me now. "He told Renner he'd stay quiet forever. Never speak Daniel's name, never chase the money, never go to authorities, as long as Renner left both families alone permanently." Renner agreed, mostly because pursuing it further risked exposing his own operation. But he made it clear the silence had to be absolute. "That's why your father changed your name. It wasn't just fear. It was the price of the deal." I sat there, absorbing the full weight of what my father had sacrificed. He hadn't simply been protecting me from vague danger. He had negotiated my identity itself as part of a survival agreement with a criminal, giving up the name he'd chosen for me in order to guarantee that Renner would never have a clean thread connecting the Hale family back to anything worth pursuing. Every quiet dinner, every ordinary Tuesday of my childhood, had been built on top of a promise my father kept at enormous personal cost. "Is Renner still alive?" "Nathan Askid." Gerald nodded slowly. "Older now, mostly retired from anything active. But he's got people still loyal to him, still protecting old interests. I don't know who showed up at your father's funeral, but if it was connected to Renner, it probably wasn't a threat exactly. More likely someone making sure the old agreement was still holding, making sure nobody had started talking." Before we left that meeting, Gerald added one more detail that neither of us expected. He said Renner had kept a private ledger for years, tracking every family he had ever silenced, every promise he had extracted in exchange for their safety. He said Renner treated those promises almost like insurance policies, reminders he could call in whenever he felt exposed. Hearing that made my stomach turn. It meant my father's silence hadn't simply protected us. It had also, unknowingly, become a tool Renner could use to reassure himself that no one from his past would ever come forward. That explanation didn't fully satisfy me. If it was simply a check-in, why would someone threaten my mother directly, telling her to stop me from asking questions? Gerald seemed to consider this seriously before answering. "Because you started asking questions publicly, digging through court records, contacting business archives. People like Renner notice patterns like that. It probably wasn't meant as a real threat so much as a warning shot, reminding your family the deal only holds if the silence holds too." Arthur suggested that with Gerald's testimony, combined with the original case files and the newly surfaced letter from my father, there might finally be enough to formally reopen the investigation into Renner's operation, this time with an actual witness willing to speak. Gerald hesitated at first, clearly weighing the risk of finally breaking a silence he'd kept for 30 years, but eventually agreed, saying he was tired of carrying guilt for young men whose only crime had been stumbling onto something they shouldn't have seen. The following months moved slower than I expected, filled with formal statements, legal consultations, and long stretches of uncertainty. Nathan and I stayed in close contact throughout, two men who had grown up as strangers but were now bound by a history neither of us had chosen. We talked about our fathers constantly, piecing together the kind of men they might have been before fear reshaped their choices, imagining birthdays and holidays that could have looked completely different if Renner had never existed. There were nights during that stretch when doubt crept in hard, when I questioned whether digging any of this up had been worth the fear it brought back into my mother's life, or the sleepless nights it cost Nathan and me both. I remember sitting in my car outside my apartment one evening, engine off, just staring at the dark windows above me, wondering if some truths are better left, buried even after they surface. But then I would think about that letter, about a father who chose silence out of love rather than convenience, and I would remind myself that finishing what he started wasn't about revenge. It was about finally letting the truth breathe after 30 years of holding its breath for us. My mother struggled with the process more than I expected. She had spent 3 decades believing the silence was simply my father's way of avoiding painful memories, never fully understanding that it had been a deliberate, costly negotiation for our safety. When I finally showed her the letter Nathan gave me, she read it twice, then held it against her chest, and cried in a way I hadn't seen since the day we buried him. "He never told me the full truth," she whispered. "He said it was safer if I only knew part of it. I always thought he was protecting his own guilt. I never realized he was protecting me too." Eventually, with Gerald's cooperation and the reopened investigation gaining traction, authorities began building a case against Renner for the original fraud, aided by financial records that modern forensic accounting could finally untangle in ways that hadn't been possible 30 years earlier. It wasn't a dramatic courtroom showdown with instant justice. It moved slowly, methodically, the way real investigations do. But for the first time in 3 decades, the silence our fathers had been forced into finally started cracking open toward something resembling accountability. During this time, Nathan and I visited the cemetery together, standing where the man in the gray coat had first spoken those 3 impossible words. We didn't know for certain who he was, whether he worked for Renner or simply carried old information from someone connected to that world. Part of me suspected we might never know for sure. But standing there with Nathan, someone who understood exactly what it meant to inherit a secret you never asked for, I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with answers and everything to do with finally not carrying the weight alone. "Our fathers loved us enough to disappear into their own fear," Nathan said quietly, staring at the fresh grass covering my father's grave. "That has to count for something." I thought about that for a long time afterward. My father hadn't been a perfect man. He had kept an enormous truth from me for my entire life, reshaping my identity without ever asking whether I wanted that protection. But sitting with everything I now understood, I couldn't find room for anger anymore. Only a deep, aching respect for a man who chose silence. Not out of cowardice, but out of a desperate, imperfect kind of love. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors eventually secured enough evidence to formally charge Renner with financial crimes connected to the original laundering scheme, using Gerald's testimony alongside newly reconstructed financial trails. Renner, now elderly, and facing the reality of consequences he had avoided for 3 decades, ultimately accepted a plea agreement rather than risk a lengthy trial, one that included a formal admission of the operation that had forced 2 young families into hiding all those years ago. It wasn't the dramatic justice you see in movies. There was no courtroom outbursts, no triumphant walk down marble steps, just quiet paperwork, a plea deal, and a small mention in the local news that most people scrolled past without a second thought. But for Nathan and me, it meant something enormous. It meant the silence our fathers carried for 30 years finally had an ending, a formal acknowledgement that what happened to them had been real, and that they hadn't simply been men who ran from responsibility, but men who ran to protect the people they loved most. There was one more piece of the story I didn't expect, something that arrived almost a year after Renner's plea deal was finalized. I received a small package at my apartment. No return address. The handwriting on the front, unmistakably familiar, even though I had only seen it once before. It was the same careful script from the letter my father had written to Daniel 3 decades earlier. Inside was a single key and a note that read, "Storage Unit 214, Route 9 Self-Storage. He wanted you to have this when it was finally safe." I sat with that note for 2 full days before I worked up the nerve to drive out there. Part of me wondered if this was some final trick, some last test from whoever had been watching our family for years. But another part of me, the part that had spent the last year learning just how deeply my father had loved me in silence, believed this was exactly what it claimed to be. A final gift, delayed by circumstances neither of us controlled. Nathan came with me. We stood outside that rusted metal door together, and when I finally lifted it open, we found a small room filled with boxers, carefully labeled in my father's handwriting. Photographs of him and Daniel from before everything fell apart. Business documents that painted a fuller picture of the friendship the 2 men had before fear reshaped their lives, and a small wooden box tucked in the back corner that neither of us expected. Inside the wooden box was a second letter, this one addressed directly to me, dated only a few months before my father passed. I sat down right there on the concrete floor of that storage unit and read it slowly, my hands shaking harder with every line. He wrote that he had always intended to tell me the truth eventually, once he was certain it was finally safe, once he was certain Renner's reach had truly faded. He wrote that he was proud of the man I had become, even though that man had been shaped, in part, by a lie he never wanted to tell. "I hope one day you understand." The letter read that protecting you never felt like a burden. It felt like the only thing I ever did right when everything else fell apart around me. If you're reading this, it means I ran out of time to tell you myself, and for that, I am more sorry than words can hold. I sat in that storage unit for almost an hour before I could stand back up. Nathan sat beside me the entire time, not saying much, just present in the way only someone who understood exactly what I was feeling could be. When I finally stood, I felt something settle inside me that had been unsteady since the day of the funeral. A kind of closure I hadn't realized I was still missing. We brought the boxers home that day, and over the following weeks, my mother and I went through them together, piecing together photographs and letters that painted a version of my father neither of us had fully known. A younger man, full of ambition, deeply loyal to the people he loved, willing to lose everything rather than let harm reach the people counting on him. It didn't erase the pain of learning the truth so suddenly at his graveside, but it gave that pain a shape I could finally hold, understand, and eventually begin to carry with something closer to peace than grief. In the months that followed, I legally chose to keep the name Ethan. It felt strange at first, holding on to an identity my father had built as a shield, now that the danger behind it had finally faded. But Ethan wasn't just a name meant to hide me anymore. It had become the name of the man I actually grew into, shaped by a father who loved me enough to sacrifice everything quietly, without ever asking for recognition or thanks. Nathan and I stayed close, after everything settled, meeting for dinner every few months, calling each other on the anniversaries of our father's hardest days. We became something neither of us expected when this all began, not quite brothers, but something close, bound by a shared history that had shaped both our lives long before we understood why. Sometimes the family you find isn't the one written on a birth certificate. Sometimes it's built from shared scars and matching questions finally answered together. My mother eventually found peace with the truth, too, though it took longer for her than it did for me. She started talking about my father differently, not as a man who kept secrets from her, but as a man who carried an impossible burden so she and I could live an ordinary, unafraid life. She told me once, sitting on that same porch where everything had unraveled, that love sometimes looks like silence, and sometimes silence is the loudest way a person can say they'd do anything to keep you safe. I think about the man in the gray coat sometimes, wondering if he'll ever resurface, now that the truth is finally out in the open, now that there's nothing left to protect by staying silent. Maybe he was simply a messenger checking whether old promises still held. Maybe he'll never appear again, now that the debt has finally been paid in full, not with money, but with truth. Either way, I'm no longer afraid of whatever he represented. The secret that shaped my entire identity finally has nowhere left to hide. Looking back now, I understand that my father didn't just give me a name at birth. He gave me an entire architecture of protection, one built quietly, sacrificially, and without a single word of complaint for over 3 decades. Caleb Weiss might have been the name he originally wanted for me, a tribute to his own father, a piece of family history he had to abandon in a single terrifying week. But Ethan Hale became the name of a man who was loved enough to be hidden, protected enough to grow up without ever knowing the dangers circling quietly at the edges of his childhood. If you were in my position, standing at a graveside hearing a stranger speak a name that wasn't yours, would you have chased the truth the way I did, or would you have let it stay buried with the man who built his entire life around protecting you from it? I'd love to hear what you would have done in the comments below. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who might need a reminder that love sometimes hides in the quietest, most unexpected places. Thank you for spending time with The Quiet Rise. I'll see you in the next story.